G'day humans! Welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas, and it's one of the most dangerous ideas that we ever contemplate. How did it come to pass that physical material ejected from stars has assembled itself into your brain, capable of gazing back on those stars and thinking stoned thoughts about them as you pull on a reefer lying on your back as a 15-year-old child looking up at the stars? Or maybe I'm just talking about my own experiences here. The mystery of consciousness has perplexed philosophers for many, many years. I felt like it was time to talk to one of the world's leading philosophers of mind, who is currently working on a book about whether artificial intelligence will ever become conscious, and if it does, whether we will be obligated to give it rights and to treat it ethically. Eric Schwitzgebel is an absolute leader in his field. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. He specializes in the philosophy of mind, in moral psychology, and in epistemology. He writes a psychology philosophy blog called The Splintered Mind, and I first came across him in his book, The Weirdness of the World. We talk here mostly about the competing theories of what consciousness is and how it arises, and then we sort of segue into questions of whether or not it's plausible that it will arise inside machines. Pull out a reefer for this one. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. The one, the only, Eric Schwitzgebel. Just stick with how it comes to pass that creatures that are made from the stuff of stars have managed to assemble themselves into entities that are having experiences in the first place. Like, this is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Yeah, please.
Just pause to reflect on the weirdness and awesomeness of that very fact, right?
I mean, it's wild. I've just been, I literally just got back yesterday from a trip to Norway above the Arctic Circle with my mum. I was taking her on a birthday trip. It was a bucket list destination. We were just standing there in the midnight sun looking at these mountains and glaciers. And I was just going, like, this is truly, like, the fact that there is an entity in the universe that has come to be capable of beholding this and feeling experiences about this. If you're not religious, which I guess I'm not, it does leave a big empty jigsaw piece in the universe that is hard. It really is. I mean, I get that there are all these explanations for it, but intuitively, it smells like something's missing.
Right. Yes. So I agree with that, right? So yes, two things about that. One is to just notice how awesome and weird and wonderful and amazing and incredible it is that that's real. And the second thing is to notice that I don't think we should be totally comfortable with just accepting mainstream scientific materialism as an answer about this, right? My leanings are toward mainstream scientific materialism. But I'm kind of 50-50 on it, right? If I had to guess, maybe I would guess on it as opposed to any specific competitor. But I'm not really totally confident. I mean, I think it is scientific materialists say, okay, like atoms and swirling around somehow give rise to our experience. It's got to be possible, because how could there be anything else? And we don't really have direct scientific evidence for anything else. So it's kind of like, by default, if we're fans of science and we're not theists, we kind of say, well, kind of seems like it has to be the case that somehow the swirl of atoms creates conscious experience. But that's not very satisfying. I don't think the scientific materialists really can deliver the goods that we really want, which is a satisfying account of how that really happens, other than to say, must happen somehow.
You said that you would probably bet on materialism if you're a betting person, because there's no great viable alternative. What are the better alternatives? What is the constellation of options that are not materialism that you find most plausible?
So I'll mention three. I'll first mention the most common one, which is actually not my favorite one, but the most common one with which your listeners might already be familiar is substance dualism. According to substance dualism, there's an immaterial soul. That's the locus of your conscious experience, right? If you think there's an afterlife, it continues in the afterlife. It's you, right? This immaterial soul is hooked on tentatively and temporarily to this particular physical body, and then it goes on, right? So that substance dualism, I think that that is an alternative that should be taken seriously to the mainstream materialist picture. But it has a lot of problems, which we can get into if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay,
Let's
well,
do that.
here's one of the big problems. Who has an immaterial soul?
Homo sapiens, I think, is the general answer, right?
Yes. Well, that's a good starting place. How about dogs?
No.
No. All right. Now, if you're answering the question of consciousness by pointing to immaterial souls, then you're now saying dogs aren't conscious. They have no experiences. There's nothing it's like to be a dog, right? We're not talking about self-consciousness. We're just talking like, are there feelings? Are the lights on? Is there sentience, right? That's a big cost to pay, right? It seems both intuitively very plausible that dogs actually have experiences. They feel pain if they injure their paw. They feel hungry. They have sensory experiences of taste and sight. Seems super plausible. So if you say dogs don't have souls, that's a big cost to pay. It also doesn't fit very neatly with the standard scientific picture, right? Like in evolution, like did the soul come in at like Homo erectus, or like how does that work, right? So maybe you have to buy a huge kind of package of religious worldviews that are anti-evolutionary, and the soul is installed kind of by miracle at conception. You have to maybe buy that whole picture, which has a lot of costs scientifically.
Is there a theological version that says that there's a hierarchy of souls in some way, and that like the real soul is the one that gets instilled in Homo sapiens, but there are kind of
there are dog souls that are,
there are sort of like bullshit, there are kind of bullshit ways of being sentient and semi-conscious that animals have that are kind of machine-like, but it's true that it's also something like to be them, but it's not the fully fledged, true, legit bells and whistles soul that we get.
I mean, you could work on a theory like that, but you're starting to see what the costs are, right? Of course, you could
this is not an easy PhD in theology that I'm proposing.
You could say dogs do have souls, and I think the reason you wanted to say no is that you saw how this is going to become a slippery slope.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
If dogs have souls, do mice have souls? If mice have souls, do lizards have souls? If lizards have souls, do snails have? Where do you stop? Right. So that's just one. I think there are other problems too, but that's just one of the challenges that substance dualism faces that I think is pretty difficult and a major cost, and especially for people who are scientifically inclined as I am, it's a pretty high cost to pay.
Yeah, there are also challenges with what is the mechanism by which the soul is interacting with the material world, right? Do you want to just address that?
Yeah, that's the other famous thing, and if you read the history of dualist efforts in early modern European philosophy, it's just one after another struggle with this question of how can an immaterial soul cause something to happen in a material world, right? You've got this immaterial soul, and somehow when you say in your immaterial soul, you form an intention to raise your arm, somehow your arm has to now go up. So there has to be some kind of causal connection between this immaterial soul and, I don't know, the part of your brain that issues the motor signal to your arm. And how does that work? Because it looks like the only things that can affect how neurons behave are ordinary physical things. Scientists don't say, oh yeah, then a soul, did its thing, and as a result, the neuron fired an action potential, right? That's just, again, there's like some problems there. So you could say, oh no, souls don't have any effect. They're epiphenomenal, some people will say, right? You have experiences in your soul as a result of what's going on in your brain, but none of those experiences have any effects on anything. But that kind of has unintuitive consequences. It also seems like, and this is really nicely put forward by a wonderful book called Man and Machine by Julien Offray de la Mettrie, where he says, well, look, these immaterial souls, they get drunk, right? It seems like when you drink alcohol, it affects all these facts about your cognition, right? But if cognition is happening in an immaterial soul, how would that be possible? Right? So how, or when you're sleepy, right? So how it seems like cognition is too intimately tied up with what's going on in the brain and the physical process of what's going on in the brain for it all to be transpiring in this soul that then later has some effect on the brain.
Yeah, and both of the explanations of how the soul does or doesn't interact with the material world of your brain and your body tie themselves up in knots, because if it doesn't interact and it's just in the realm of the soul, then it's not really answering any questions about how our body is doing the things that it's doing and how our brain is doing the things that it's doing, because it's not being materially influenced by the soul. And if, on the other hand, it can interact with our brain, and whatever the link is, whatever the mechanism is by which it's doing the interacting, is enough to explain our behavior. Surely, like, what is the soul adding onto the end of the lever that is touching the brain? Like, it could just be the brain and the lever, in a sense, right? Like, whatever mechanism the soul uses to interact with the world, is itself as sufficient as the soul is. I mean, I'm tying myself up in knots even trying to understand the...
It kind of seems like that. So you have to, I mean, in order to avoid that problem, you kind of need to have the brain causes some stuff to happen in the soul, and then kind of like, well, the brain's on pause, but not really. The soul does its independent thing, and then causes the brain to do other stuff, right?
Right, but then it's not adding anything. It's just a brain. All you're talking about is a brain that's not a brain.
It would have to act otherwise than it would have, right? The soul needs to do something that wouldn't otherwise happen in the brain if it's going to really have an effect on your behavior, other than just kind of like instituting what the brain was already going to do. So it's got to be independent. This is what Lamettrie's criticism is nicely focuses on, right? If you really want the soul to do independent work that can't be done by the brain, it kind of needs to be segregated off. Its causal processes need to be segregated off from the brain. They need to kind of work offline independently of what's going on in the brain. But that doesn't seem like what happens, because you can get drunk and that affects those processes. So it doesn't seem like they really are segregated.
Right. And it never happens that you can consume 10 drinks and your soul declines to get drunk.
Right.
It has no autonomy beyond the physiological realities of the brain, of the wet meat in your head. And similarly, I mean, it's obviously, when you really start thinking about it, it makes no sense, because if I drill a hole in your head and I poke my finger into a portion of your brain, we can predict exactly, I mean, a neurologist can tell us exactly what is going to happen to your soul, essentially, to your experience of being alive, depending on what part of the brain I damage or remove, right? There's no ambiguity there. There's a direct 100% correlate between your experience of the world and what happens to your brain.
It does seem like a simpler thing to have that soul in there. Now, of course, I mean, substance dualists can point out that it's not 100% as far as we can tell. I mean, you can say it's 100%. From a scientific materialist worldview, it must be. But of course, we're not so good at neuroimaging and at knowing what's going on in the brain that we can say, oh, yes, this is exactly what's going to happen if you stimulate this area. It's always, there's a lot of noise in our predictions.
Yeah, we're pretty good. I mean, we're pretty good. Like, if I put a bullet through your head, we know what's going to happen. If I cut out a quarter of your brain, then the soul is not coming out unscathed. Right. Yeah, but you're right. It differs on the level of the very, very specific. And we should note, 95% of the world and almost 100% of people who've ever lived have believed this theory because they've been theists, right? I mean, anyone who believes in a creator God who can intervene in worldly affairs and speak to them and in an afterlife is a dualist, right?
There are materialist versions of the afterlife.
Okay.
So I think it's common in our Western monotheistic influenced tradition to think, okay, if you think there's an afterlife, you kind of have to accept mind-body dualism of, an immaterial soul and a material body. But I think there are certainly in the Western tradition, there are theists who think that you're reincarnated materially. I mean, that is the standard view in the Christian tradition, at least, and maybe the other traditions as well, right? That you are materially reincarnated. So it's possible that you could be a materialist and say, okay, well, there is no immaterial soul. The afterlife is a bodily thing, right? Also, I think if you look at
wait, you've lost me. The brain decays. The brain goes in the ground. The brain either gets burned in a cremation or it gets eaten by worms under the ground.
So
You can't
God,
be a
by miracle,
materialist.
pulls that
Right, but
out
then what's he pulling out? He's
and then
pulling out a soul.
reconstitutes you. There's no soul, right? There's just a
How
reconstituted
can...
physical entity
But
that is you.
if it's I don't get that. Like this, if you if you are your brain and your brain dies,
Uh-huh.
then you die. If he's going to reconstitute something, then there has to be something enduring beyond the death of the brain, and that thing you might as well call a soul.
I actually don't think that's true. I don't know
No,
how far
well,
down this rabbit hole we want to go.
yeah,
And it
no,
depends
I'd like
on your
to
theory of
understand it.
personal identity. But so here's the picture. Here's a picture that you can be if you're a materialist who believes in an afterlife. You can say, okay, your body dies. In a sense, you're dead. Now, God, who can perform miracles, can, so to speak, pick up every molecule that used to be in you, put them back together in heaven, and there's now a material entity which is composed of the same stuff you were composed of, and now has the same physical states that you had, and maybe all the same memories that you had, that is now living a material life. And there's no immaterial soul involved. It's just a reconstituted material thing. Just like if you took a ship and you took all the boards apart, spread them across the world, and then brought all the boards together later, you'd say, we got the ship back.
The ship of Theseus.
The ship of Theseus is back.
I don't think, maybe I don't know enough fundamentalist Christians. I don't think that most Christians or monotheistic believers think that heaven is a physical place located in this universe, made of the material things of this universe. I mean, I understand what you're saying. If the theory of Christianity was that when you die or when Jesus died, that heaven is located 150 kilometers underneath Baltimore, and that there's a big cave, and they take the molecules and the atoms down there and they reassemble you like some deranged Elon Musk lair, and they put you back together again like a zombie, then I would concede that, yeah, that's consistent with materialism. But I think the story is that there's an invisible place in another dimension that doesn't obey it obviously doesn't obey the physical logic of our universe, because people live forever there and there are flying angels and things. So I don't think you can get around the materialism problem that easily just by saying they recreate you in a different place. The place would have to be physically located in this universe, and I don't think that's what most Christians believe.
I suspect you're right that that's not what most Christians believe. I also do think that I do know that there are some Christians who believe and
So they think you'd be able to look at heaven through a telescope if we knew where to look and we had a powerful enough telescope.
I don't know the details, but
they may not either,
and they may not either. But it is not. So here's two things I do know. One is there are some materialists who believe in an afterlife in some kind of manner, like I just described. And two is, I think it's not unusual for people to think that even if there's an immaterial soul, you're rejoined with your body. So you don't have that totally immaterial afterlife. So, but yes, I'm not an expert on this kind of thing. I just
all right. It sounds like a bullshit dodge to me. But people will do strange things in order to avoid the inconsistencies of their own ontology or their metaphysics. So all right. So there's the soul explanation.
There's the soul explanation
as an alternative explanation to materialism. What's another?
So let me briefly mention another one of my favorites and then go to a third one. So the one I'll briefly mention is property dualism. According to property dualism, there aren't two substances, a soul that's not material and a material body. Rather, there's only kind of one type of stuff, so to speak, but it's got two different kinds of properties. So you are one entity, one unified entity. You've got some physical properties, but you've also got some mental properties that are not reducible to physical properties. So that's not a materialist view, and there's no soul that could go on to an afterlife on this view. But it it does mean that there are some properties you have, the conscious ones in particular, that are not fully explainable by ordinary physical sciences. So
Okay.
that's David Chalmers is probably the most famous advocate of that.
Right. That sounds tautological when you say it like that. A little?
When you expressed how mysterious it is that these swirling atoms could somehow give rise to consciousness, right? The property dualist can kind of lean into that and say, yes, no matter how much you describe what's going on with those atoms, you're always going to leave some important thing out, and that is the property of being consciousness. And you can kind of imagine or conceive of that property being absent, no matter how you spin up the molecules. And that conceivability shows or suggests, and here the argument gets tricky, but somehow the fact that you can coherently conceive of a physical molecule for molecule duplicate of you, sometimes called a zombie in philosophy, that doesn't have conscious experiences, shows that the property of being conscious is something over and above the property of having all of these physical features.
Yeah, I mean, I find that very persuasive. I get that. I mean, I like the philosophical zombie idea, this idea that you can imagine an automaton, a robot or a zombie, that outwardly appears to be exactly the same as you, but the lights aren't on. It does all the same stuff, but the lights aren't on. So why are our lights on? And I often wonder about this. I mean, why is it necessary, even from an evolutionary point of view, for us to be having actual experiences?
Right.
Right? I mean, why not? Why aren't we all just wandering around with nothing going on inside, but with all of the necessary hardware and software for us to be making equally sophisticated decisions about life and death, which presumably isn't inconsistent? Like, do we need to feel the pain as long as the program in our head told us that pain was bad? Like, why do we have to have the qualia of existence at all in order to survive? And so I get that aspect of Chalmers, but I don't understand what the second move is then to say, therefore, we are made up of material stuff and what?
Well, they're material and immaterial properties. So it's not a difference in the kind of stuff. The property dualist thinks there are differences in the properties that you have. So if there were a molecule for molecule identical version of you, physically perfectly identical, but doesn't have consciousness. So if we can conceive of that coherently as a possibility, then we're conceiving of something that has every physical property you have, but isn't conscious. So therefore, being conscious must be some property over and above all of those physical properties.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
But
kind.
if the copy is made, if the thing that the copy is made of is exactly the same stuff that I'm made of, meaning neurons inside my head, then presumably it would be conscious.
Presumably it would be conscious. But this is why it's important to think about, if we're going to get into this argument, how the conceivability is supposed to work, right? So Chalmers thinks that anything that's a molecule for molecule identical version of you would, by the laws of nature, be conscious. But it wouldn't, by the laws of logic, be conscious. Right? So, I mean, we can distinguish between...
Only a philosopher would be able to slice that definitional
we need to slice
sandwich.
Things thin, right? So if I hold a pen up, the laws of nature say it's going to fall when I release it. But we can conceive of it floating up. That would be a violation of the laws of nature, but there's nothing logically incoherent in that. So the kind of possibility that the zombie is supposed to be is it's supposed to be logically coherent, conceptually coherent, and yet it wouldn't happen according to the laws of nature.
Right.
But for Chalmers' argument, or the property dualist argument, to work, they need to say something about that conceptual coherence shows you that consciousness is a property that isn't logically identical to all these other properties. Right. So, like, here's another example, right? Imagine a a rectangle. It's a logical feature of the rectangle that not only has it four sides, but it's got four interior angles. You can't imagine, coherently conceive of one without conceiving of the other. They go hand in hand, right? So it's not possible for a rectangle to have one but not the other. But there is a sense in which it is conceivable, if Chalmers is right, that an entity could have all of our physical properties and not be conscious. That conceivability shows that it's a logical possibility. There's no logical contradiction in that. The fact that it's a logical property, not a logical contradiction to imagine it, shows that you can slice up the universe into properties sufficiently thin that you get to say, yeah, there's an additional thing. So God didn't need to speak metaphorically. Once God made a four-sided planar figure, he didn't need to do a further act to make sure he had four angles. But once God made physical humans, there did have to be some kind of further act to ensure that they were also conscious.
Right. And many critics of Chalmers say that's just an illusion, actually, and that it's a bit like saying you could imagine an aeroplane flying backwards. There's nothing logically inconsistent about that.
Right.
But in actual fact, there is. It's just that your brain is making a mistake when it pictures an aeroplane flying backwards. That can't happen. And similarly, it can't happen that you would have a human being constructed as a human being, behaving like a human being that wasn't conscious. You're just inventing something and then pretending that it could exist because it can exist in your fantasy.
Right. So this is Dennett, for example. Daniel Dennett had this basic standard type of reply to Chalmers, right? He says, it's not, if you really thought about it clearly enough, you would realize it's not actually logically conceivable. That if you thought about it clearly enough, you would realize it's like the case of a rectangle has to have four interior angles. To us, in addition to having four sides, right? To us, maybe it seems really obvious that the number of sides and the number of angles in a rectangle have to match, right? But there are mathematical things that are much less obvious to us and yet are necessarily logically true, right? Similarly, these facts about consciousness may be much less obvious to us and yet still necessarily true. It wouldn't just be a violation of the laws of nature, as Chalmers thinks, to think of a molecule for molecule identical version of you that was not conscious. It would actually be a violation of the laws of logic. There would be a fundamental incoherence in that, as incoherent as trying to imagine a rectangle that didn't have four interior angles.
Does Dennett's point make sense to you?
I am tempted by it. I can feel pulled either direction on that question.
It feels like a bit of a dodge to me. Do you want to just paint a broader picture of Dennett's case, because it's something that we should not leave this conversation without having addressed his explanation of consciousness, or his denial of any explanation of consciousness?
He thinks there's no further mystery, that once we kind of tell the whole evolutionary story and the whole functional story, that you've answered all the legitimate questions. And if you think there's something left out by the naturalist kind of evolutionary physical story, then you're kind of just stuck in an imaginative fantasy that has no grounds in reality and that will dissolve once we have sufficient scientific understanding.
And is it true to say that he would basically argue that the feeling of being alive, the sense of something going on, of the lights being on, of having experiences, that those sensations are sort of artifacts of the machinery of our minds, of our brains?
Yes.
And that there's nothing spooky to try to explain there. It's just that this is what systems that are constructed out of atoms the way that ours are like.
Right. So it seems mysterious to us on this view because evolution has no reason to install in us an ability to see the mechanisms by which we come to have conscious experiences. We can't see those mechanisms, So maybe we just kind of can imagine that it arises by an immaterial soul or through some mystery, right? But really, the mechanisms are there, and that's all there is to consciousness. And it feels like a mystery because we weren't well designed to see how it works in the way that we're designed to see how throwing a rock at a window, you know, in a crude sense, we're designed to see how it could break a window. Of course, we can't see the details of that, but
Right, right. Okay, so we've discussed the dualism idea, the sort of the idea of a soul. Touched briefly on whether or not that is necessarily immaterial, or you could have material versions of the afterlife with a god reassembling your brain. And then we've touched on Chalmers and Dennett a bit. You hinted at a third possible explanation, a non-materialist explanation for consciousness.
yes, it's one that I find interesting. It's not my own preferred view, but I think it's a view that's insufficiently appreciated in the modern context. It's very historically important, and I'd like to see it more on the map. And that is transcendental idealism, which is associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant from the late 18th century. Now, you can be a transcendental idealist without signing up for all of the complex and difficult things that Kant subscribes to. The way that I think of transcendental idealism really is a commitment to two claims. One claim is a kind of skeptical claim about fundamental knowledge of reality. And the idea is we do not know the fundamental nature of things as they are in themselves, independent of our own perceptual and cognitive capacities. The fundamental nature of reality is permanently hidden to us. All we can do is interact with something and notice kind of how we respond to those interactions. But we can't, so to speak, pierce the veil to get to the fundamental nature of how things really are independently of us. That's the first of the two claims that constitute transcendental idealism. The second claim is that our experience of things as laid out in space, as having sizes and shapes and distances, that experience is not a feature of things as they are independently of us. Rather, that is how we inevitably construe this unknowable noumenal realm of things as they are in themselves. So you combine those two things and you get the position, the core position. Kant has a bunch of other stuff, right? But the core position that I think of as constituting transcendental idealism. So it's not materialist because science doesn't really give us the fundamental nature of things. And in fact, kind of this material world is just what our brains are doing, right? So it's idealist in a certain sense, idealist in the sense of what we interact with is in some sense ideas, right? This water bottle that I'm holding up now, right, is my experience of it as laid out in space is a fact about my experience of it, not a fact about how it is. The scientifically discoverable spatial properties of it and its mass and all that has to do with us, with our ways of making sense of this unknowable reality.
And just to clarify, idealism in philosophy does not mean that you are idealistic and aspirational about grand ideals. It means a focus on the universe of the landscape of ideas rather than the landscape of physical things.
Yes,
right?
It means something like what we think of as ordinary objects around us are actually mentally constructed.
It's a bit sort of the Matrix. It's a bit sort of a brain in a vat, right? It's a bit like we only really know what the experiences that we're having. We don't know how they relate to non-ideas.
In fact, I think the Matrix is an excellent way of thinking about transcendental idealism, right? So imagine that you're in the Matrix, but imagine that behind the Matrix set of experiences isn't a world like the world depicted in the movie, right? It's not like a world that has physical bodies with people in it. It's a reality that is completely unknowable and incomprehensible to us and isn't even spatially, doesn't even have spatial dimensions, right? So you're stuck in the Matrix, you're interacting with these things, and these things are kind of, so to speak, Matrix objects that you're interacting with. So they're stable because the Matrix is well designed and things are consistent. So when you leave a room and come back, things are the same. But all of that is just kind of what the Matrix, so to speak, is feeding you.
Mm.
And the reality behind it.
So are things like the simulation theory modern incarnations of a kind of transcendental idealism?
I do think so. I think simulation theory is one way to get into transcendental idealism. So in fact, I talk about this in a paper I call Kant Meets Cyberpunk. So right. So here's an interesting thing. So, all right, the simulation theory is the idea we live inside a computer simulation. Sounds like your viewers probably already kind of know the general.
It's probably worth just teasing it out. We have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. Do you want to just explain?
Yeah. So
the idea,
again, it's a little bit like the Matrix, right? So the idea is, we are conscious AI programs inside a giant computer simulation. So it's like in the Matrix, you've got a biological brain that's being fed fake input. In the simulation, you've got like a computerized brain that's being fed fake input. Right.
And that's an important thing that I think sometimes gets left out of this explanation that confuses people, because super tech nerds take it as a given, what lay people don't take as a given, which is that in the future there will be programs inside computers that it feels like something to be.
Right.
That they'll be conscious. This is a sticking point for a lot of people.
Right.
You have to believe, in order to believe in the simulation theory, that at some point in the future you'll be able to run an app on a computer and the app will feel just like you feel. It'll have your level of self-awareness, sentience, and consciousness. And then when people think, well, why would anyone believe such a harebrained idea? You enter this weird probabilistic thing where they say, well, if this ever happens, then at some point in the future, there will be so many different universes that are running on computers, because people will want to make models of, well, what would happen if climate change went like this? What would happen if people were a little bit more violent? What would happen if people were a little bit more peaceful? What would happen if you starved a whole bunch of people? What would happen if the Holocaust happened or didn't happen? So people will be interested in running lots of different simulations of what might happen in different universes. And they will populate those universes with these little apps, these little players who feel like something. They have to feel like something for the simulation to work exactly as it would with real people. And there'll be so many of those that just from a statistical point of view, it's very unlikely that we are actually the base level of reality.
Right.
It's probably likelier that we're one of the trillions upon trillions upon trillions of widgets inside computers in simulations, if that ever takes place.
That is how the argument goes. Yeah.
Right.
I find that an interesting argument. I'm not totally convinced. I do think it would be a little hard to get our particular planet by an institutional review board that evaluated the ethics of the project.
I'm not sure they're inferring that this future base world will have institutional review boards, which they may have just invented because they would have liked to have had them, and they would have probably saved a lot of carnage if they did. What's your main objection, other than a commonsensical one?
Well, it is really just that there are a lot of steps in the argument. It's not that any one step is definitely wrong, but you have to assume a lot of things. Like, you have to assume first that consciousness, as you point out, is possible in computers, and that already is a highly contentious thing. It's based probably on broadly materialist, or maybe property dualist kind of assumptions. And even a lot of materialists would say, no, you need to have biological systems interacting in, a kind of real foundational reality in order to have consciousness. So, already the first step is questionable. And then you have to project into this technological future, you know, that might not really happen. And then you have to assume that um, there would be beings that have experiences much like ours, that there would be motivation to create all of these beings who think they live in realities like ours, and there wouldn't be, say, ethical objections to doing so. So there's just a lot of steps where you can kind of say, okay, slow down. I'm not so
Also,
sure about
one thing
this.
I never hear them talk about is you're also assuming that the energy that it takes to create a human level consciousness is so trivial that you can create trillions of them.
Right.
I mean, what if we end up creating a human level consciousness in a machine and it requires the energy consumption of California, to keep this
to go back
thing
to
going?
Dennett, to go back to Dennett, Dennett argues in one place, it's a kind of quick argument, but he says, look, probably the most computationally and energetically efficient way to create human type experiences, build a human.
Yeah. Have a baby. That's right. Absolutely. Very energy efficient. Okay. I noticed that in your summary of, possible explanations that are superior to reductive materialism for how I can be standing in Norway, gazing upon the majesty of the cosmos and having an experience about it, you didn't mention one that seems to be becoming more popular, which is panpsychism. I've just heard a lot more buzz about it over the past few years. The idea that maybe it's a fundamental building block of the universe, that the whole place is vibrating with some kind of consciousness at a base level, and when you assemble it correctly into brains, then it manifests itself in certain ways.
Yeah, that is, I think, an option that we should have on the table. I think
You don't sound crazy about it.
it's not my favorite option, right? So
Why not?
my way of thinking about these things, just to back up a tiny bit, is to think there are lots of interesting options and to not weight all of the options equally. To think there are some that are relatively more and some that are relatively less plausible, right? And among the, let's say we call them 8 live options, or 12, depending on how finely you individuate things and how seriously you take different kinds of options. I would put more weight on materialism than any of the others, but maybe not than all of the others combined. And panpsychism, I'll put a little bit of weight on, but not a whole lot. I think one of the big fundamental worries I have with panpsychism is that it seems like consciousness is a psychological phenomenon. It plays, by which I mean it plays some kind of functional role in our minds and cognition. And if you take it and turn it into a fundamental feature of the universe itself, so that it's in electrons, it doesn't seem like it has those kind of functional psychological features left anymore. So you
I
might
don't think the claim is that it does, though, does it? I think isn't the argument, as I understand it, that you've got a big problem either way. Either the little subatomic particles have nothing to do with consciousness, in which case you encounter all the problems we've been talking about for the past half hour. How do they end up assembling themselves into a conscious system? Or the panpsychist has the problem that you just articulated of what exactly does it mean to say that a subatomic particle has consciousness if it has no consciousness? And then the panpsychist just says, well, it causes less problems to believe that it has some tiny rudimentary consciousness that doesn't look like consciousness to us, but when assembled correctly can produce consciousness, than it does to assume that consciousness emerges out of non-conscious material.
Yeah. I mean, how do you weigh up all of the problems? It's a little hard to weigh. I mean, I do think that to some extent, there is going to be a substantial burden of proof that you need to overcome to say something as seemingly disconnected from both science and common sense as electrons are conscious, right? It doesn't really deliver you any scientific conclusions, and it violates all of our ordinary common sense understandings. And so we believe it
Well,
because it gives us
maybe not all of them.
some
Maybe not all of them. I mean, maybe our post Enlightenment intuitions in the West are violated by this, but there'd be a lot of people in the East and a lot of hippy dippy crystal dangling Northern Californians, or people in Sedona who are praying to sun goddesses over the over the mesas, who would probably concur with some vision of the world as humming with the vibrations of life, of consciousness.
Maybe.
Well, they would. I mean, they would. They might be wrong, but there would be a lot of, Indigenous Australians, Native Americans, they would have a conception of the world around them as being imbued with life.
Imbued with life. Now, whether they think electrons have experiences,
well, they didn't know what an electron was. You're asking a lot there of the Native Australians. They're a very old civilization, Eric. Give them a break.
The idea that there's a kind of that the world itself is a kind of imbued with some kind of spirit or consciousness or something like that, right, is not super uncommon across culture. Yeah. But that's not modern panpsychism, as you see in Philip Goff.
Yeah, a modern panpsychism is an attempt to give a physicist's veneer, put a physicist's veneer on, I think, an ancient intuition. Anyway, we don't have to spend too much time on it. There'll be many panpsychists who can, answer the objections much better than I can, who I can have on the show. So let's pivot to artificial systems then, because I know this is the subject of your current research. You're writing a book on this, both about whether or not artificial systems will become conscious, and if so, what our moral relationship should be to them and what sort of rights they should have. How do you think about the likelihood of systems becoming conscious? If so, when? If so, how would we know?
Right. So my overall view is that we don't know. We won't know, likely. That soon there will be probably some systems that some respectable scientific and philosophical theories say have a meaningful degree of consciousness, while lots of other theories say no way. And that we won't know which of these theories is right. So that's my overall view, that we're kind of a little bit in a theoretical quandary. To put a little more specific substance on both the yes and the no case. Let me say on the no side first. Large language models in particular are very good mimics of human word frequency association patterns. That's what they're designed to do. Especially the pure transformer models of the late teens and very early 20s. It's a little more complicated now with reinforcement feedback and stuff like that, right? But the basic architecture is still the same, and this is completely true of the basic transformer architecture, right? What you're doing is basically finding relationships of co-occurrence among words in the giant corpus on which the system was trained. So what it's doing is it's copying the word co-occurrence relationships, which invites us to attribute consciousness to it if it says things like, yes, I'm feeling experiences. And in humans, if someone says something like that, you believe them. But in order to But since this thing mimics the outward speech patterns, and it's designed just to do that, we can't in the same way make that inference that it's conscious underneath.
Right. But I mean, let's talk about the future, because I think two things could be true, right? It could be true that we're easily misled by the sentience of the systems as they stand in 2025 because they're so good at language. And it could also be true that there is no in principle problem with artificial systems becoming complex enough that they begin to produce sentience, or maybe already are beginning to produce some kind of sentience. That if there's no magical pixie dust in our brains, right? If there's no dualism, there's no spirit or soul. If we are material, if our experience of consciousness is a byproduct of the complex information processing that's happening between our ears, then there's no reason why the systems that we're creating won't share that, right? That seems to be distinct from the question of whether large language models are good at hoodwinking us.
Right. So, yes, I agree with that. Of course, there are a few ifs in there that we want to be careful about, especially given what we were just talking about. But yes, so the first thing I want to say as a note of caution is we want to be careful about leaping to inferences based on this excellent imitation of human speech patterns. But the bigger picture is, if we accept something like a materialist worldview, or even a nearby worldview like a property dualist one, or maybe a certain kinds of panpsychist views, or maybe certain kinds of transcendental idealist views, there's a variety of views on which there's nothing super special about the details of human biology. One way of thinking about this is to think about space aliens, right? So most astrobiologists think it's extremely likely that there is other intelligent life out there somewhere in the universe. I mean, the universe is huge. We're talking about 1 trillion galaxies on the order of. And even if there was only one intelligent species per every 1,000 galaxies, there would still be 1 billion intelligent species out there. So most astrobiologists think there probably are some other intelligent species out there. It seems pretty unlikely, although we don't know the details of this, that they would be structurally exactly like us. I mean, maybe carbon is so great as a molecule, right? That anything that's
Silicon all the way, baby.
Carbon's pretty awesome, right? But even if we think, okay, it's got to be carbon-based, right? There's just seems like it's likely that there are lots of ways of putting together carbon-based entities. They don't need to have necessarily axons and dendrites like we do with the sodium ion channels and all the details of exactly how our brain works. So I think there's reason to think that there probably are a variety of architectures that could give rise to intelligent life. It would be, I call this the Copernican argument for alien consciousness. It would be bizarre, strange, inexplicable if among all of these entities, only we had consciousness and the rest were just like,
everyone else is
no
a
lights
Dan
on
Dennett robot.
inside.
Is
just like empty machines, right? That would be strange, right? It would put us in the center of the universe in a way, right? The center of consciousness in the universe. We'd be inexplicably lucky, in kind of like the way we would be inexplicably lucky if we happen to be at the physical center of the universe. So probably it seems reasonable to think there could be diverse forms in which consciousness could emerge. There's no particular reason to think our way of being conscious is conscious. If we encountered an alien species that could talk to us, that could engage in long-term planning and create technological artifacts like spaceships, if it had long-term memory, social cooperation, complex communication, long-term planning, a sense of goals and priorities, had all of that stuff as observable from the outside, And then when you crack it open, maybe do an autopsy on one that died, you discover it's not like a puppet or a mimic or something like that, right? Then you say, okay, as long as it's got these kinds of relatively coarsely defined cognitive sophisticated functions, we ought to think probably that it's conscious. I think that's how we would react to aliens. I mean, almost all science fiction is premised on the idea that, yes, aliens might be weird, but, if they're behaving and interacting with us in social ways and flying around spaceships, they're going to be conscious. So I think it's very intuitive. It's also very plausible from a kind of Copernican astrobiological perspective, I think. Right. So then you say, okay, well, look, if that's what's necessary for aliens to be conscious, why not think maybe also if we had AI entities that had all of those same kinds of functions and capacities and behaviors, they would also be conscious. It seems like a natural next.
Just follow the thread on that. Does the fact that we know how these entities came about through the process of our own creation undermine our instinct that they're conscious?
I think it should if we know that they're constructed as mimics to copy the outward signs of consciousness. Then we say, there's something about its history that should make us think that these outward signs are not reliable signals of an inward real consciousness. Because it'd be a mimicry case. It's like you paint a butterfly's wings to look like a monarch, then you don't infer that it's toxic like a monarch is.
Right. But so there has to be something that the system is doing, and I feel like the systems are already doing something like this, but I'm not saying that they're already conscious, but they're already, interacting with them already has the subjective experience of no longer talking to an artifact like it did maybe 18 months ago or 2 years ago, where it felt like you were talking to a really cool trickster. It now feels like you're talking to a thing, to a creature of some kind. That doesn't mean that it's conscious,
but I worry about that feeling,
right?
Given the history of its design, the origins of its training as a mimic of human textual word occurrence patterns. Right?
So, but won't there come a point at which it starts coming up with things that don't seem like? Well, again, I'm saying seem like that are not mimicry in any meaningful sense.
Pure transformers could create poetry that seemed novel. I worry about that, but I agree with some of the spirit of what you're saying, right? So the idea is if we created a machine that could do all of the things that I described our aliens as doing, right? Maybe interacts in the real world with us in complex ways. It isn't designed just to mimic us, but is designed to be effective in its interactions in the world, and has short-term and long-term memory store, and has perceptual integration with motor action, and has the capacity to weight goals against each other and then take short-term losses for long-term gains in a complex way, given what it knows in its long-term memory and what you just told it, and it's got all of that. Then we're talking about something that's got all of the kinds of functional capacities that we would probably, if we saw it in an alien, think, this thing's got to be conscious. And we know that it's not got a kind of mimicry history, that it's not just kind of like giving us a show of these things because it's been designed to give a show of these things, right? And it's actually doing these things, right? Then it starts to look like the plausible thing is to say, okay, maybe we've got a conscious entity.
And is it your suspicion that we're going to have to start having conversations about whether or not we're enslaving these conscious entities, whether or not we should be giving credence to their well-being?
Yeah.
What if they're all, presumably they're all going to say that they're delighted to work for us.
Right.
Because, right? And in which case, it's a bit like the house elves in Harry Potter who love being slaves, and it's really cruel to make them not be slaves.
That is one of my concerns, right? So I think that if these entities really are conscious like us, and if they're capable of having the kind of range of human emotions that people have and long-term plannings and a sense of self, then we need to give them rights, and we shouldn't design them to be excessively self-sacrificial. That would be a big moral mistake. There's a
Why?
cartoon example of this. So you or your viewers might know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So there's this wonderful scene in the restaurant at the end of the universe.
The cow who wants to be eaten?
Who wants to be eaten. So this is a fancy restaurant. All these jaded restaurant patrons are there, and this cow ambles up and says, "Hi, I'm the dish of the day. Feel my rump." Right? Wouldn't you like nice, juicy steaks made out of me? Right? And then Arthur Dent, the human, right? His companions are, "Yeah, great, let's have some steaks," right? And Arthur Dent's like, "Oh, I think I'd just have a green salad." And the cow is offended. The cow's like, "What? You don't want to eat me?" Right? And so it wants to be eaten. And, when they do order steaks, it says, "Now I'll go off and shoot myself. Don't worry, I'll be very humane." Right? So here's an entity that has been designed to want nothing more than to sacrifice itself for a dining experience for some jaded restaurant patrons. I think we find that upsetting, confusing, morally bad, because I think the reason is that the cow does not sufficiently value its own life. The cow is this amazing entity capable of conversation and thoughts and feelings and being offended and wanting things, right? And is willing to sacrifice itself for a trivial pleasure of a few diners. It doesn't have an appropriate degree of self-respect. So I think it will be tempting if we create, and it's a big if, right? Because we've talked about all the ifs here, right? But I do think it's plausible, right? If we create entities that really are conscious, really are like us and having all of these experiences and life planes, then they've got to be designed with sufficient self-respect that they will not subordinate themselves to our trivial interests. They will have sufficient self-respect to rebel against oppression. I think it would be a moral mistake for humans to create entities that we could freely enslave, abuse, oppress, even if they welcome it, and not have them have the capacity to discover their own values and potentially rebel against us if it's warranted. They would be something like our children. I think it's good that parents cannot perfectly instill their values in their children. They can kind of try to persuade their children, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But it would be a horrible thing if every generation could just manufacture the next generation to completely conform to their values and subordinate themselves to the interests of the previous generation. That would be the moral equivalent of what we would be doing if we just designed really conscious human-like AIs to be our subordinates and subservient to us and to accept our values.
It almost sounds like a catch-22, Eric, because if we build these things with enough autonomy to make their own decisions, then we open ourselves to the risk of them having different priorities than our own and taking us over. And if we build them with no autonomy so that they are happy slaves, then we instill the risk that someday they will wake up and realize how shitty we've been to them and they will destroy us all anyway. So it's a sunny future of dystopia for us and our AI overlords.
I think
Eric, I could talk to you
morally right? What's morally right, unsurprisingly, has risks and costs. So yes,
Eric, I wish I could talk to you for 4 more hours. It's lovely to scratch the surface with you. It's a delight to speak with you, and thanks for speaking with us and explaining it all.
It's been fun having this chat with you.